Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys, now I know they have Darwin right up in this area, I think. And then you have Perth over here, but it seems like every other major Australian city is mainly here. I think Adelaide is also in this area, but mainly in this section of Australia. I'd love to know why. I think I don't know the reason. Okay, I guess this is the best climate. That's my best guess. I'm not really sure. Let's learn. Geography by Geoff, great channel. Preemptive like why Australia has no major city in the north, or even like around this area, or this area, or this. Just why here, and then mostly here.
Huge country, but while most of the country has
enormous. I saw there's a website that you can go on called True Size of, right? TrueSizeOf, sorry. And it shows you, because a normal map, like one behind me, it skews the size. Anyways, all right, let's get into it.
At least one major city, such as Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, and even Hobart. Its northern coastline does not. This is a little odd because this region is so close to the primary shipping lanes connecting to Asia. So why doesn't Australia have a major city along its northern coastline?
And before anyone says Darwin is a major city, it's smaller than you probably think.
I just got called out.
Australia is a continent defined by its contradictions. It's huge, but largely empty. It's surrounded by oceans, yet much of its interior is bone dry. It has some of the most livable cities in the world, yet entire regions remain nearly uninhabited. Understanding the country's physical geography helps explain why Australians have chosen to live where they do, and why so few of them live along the country's northern coast.
That's a lot of skyscrapers.
Uninhabited.
What city is this? It almost looks like Manhattan.
The country's physical geography helps explain why Australians have chosen to live where they do, and why so few of them live along the country's northern coast. Australia is the flattest continent on Earth, lacking in towering mountain ranges or active volcanoes. Much of the interior is part of what's known as the Australian Shield, a stable and heavily eroded block of land that hasn't seen mountain building activity in hundreds of millions of years.
It seems like India would have also had that before India slammed into the southern part of Asia, millions of years ago, and created the Himalayas. It seems like India is also pretty flat, other than the Himalayas, obviously.
This has left a landscape.
I'm pausing too much, sorry.
Seen mountain building activity in hundreds of millions of years. This has left a landscape of broad plains, shallow basins, and weathered hills. And in the center lies the outback, a sweeping region of deserts and semi-arid scrubland that dominates the image most outsiders have of Australia. But surrounding this harsh core is a more varied periphery, where rainfall is more reliable and the soil somewhat more accommodating. The Great Dividing Range, which runs parallel to the east coast from Queensland down to Victoria, captures moisture from prevailing ocean winds, creating a relatively green corridor in an otherwise dry land. Major rivers like the Murray and Darling flow through this region, albeit erratically. In contrast, the northern region of Australia presents a very different face than either the outback or the fertile southern areas. It lies entirely within the tropics and is dominated by a tropical savanna climate in the west and center and a tropical monsoon climate in the northeast. Unlike the predictable seasons
to that, sure. Oh my god. For once, I'm happy for a video to be interrupted because I was waiting for a long time for that video to finish. Sorry about that. I'll react to that, sure. That happening. I'm sorry about that.
West and center, and a tropical monsoon climate in the northeast. Unlike the predictable seasons of the south, the north swings between extremes. Months of searing heat and heavy rainfall during the wet season, followed by long stretches of dryness during the rest of the year. And when it rains, it pours. The monsoon can flood rivers and turn dusty plains into wetlands overnight. But during the dry season, those same wetlands vanish, and water becomes scarce again. The terrain of the north is equally challenging. Much of the land is flat and covered in coarse grasses and scattered trees, but the soil quality is poor, heavily leached by centuries of tropical rain. Mangrove-lined estuaries, floodplains, and escarpments add further complexity to the land. Cyclones are another hazard, regularly battering the coastlines of the Northern Territory and northern Queensland, with destructive winds and heavy rains. Now, all this said,
Well, you could say the same thing about the American Southeast, in that they're battered by storms a lot, yet the American Southeast is very heavily populated, so that doesn't completely explain things.
Northern Australia is far from lifeless. The region is home to incredible biodiversity, including some of the last large, relatively untouched tropical ecosystems in the world. This, of course, also comes with some of the most dangerous wildlife and plants that
I used to not be afraid of this image,
including some of the last large, relatively
but I've watched some nature videos about the fresh... oh, wait, no, that's freshwater. I watched some videos about the saltwater crocodile, and I've never been more terrified about an animal at all.
untouched tropical ecosystems in the world. This, of course, also comes with some of the most dangerous wildlife and plants that humans have ever encountered. One such plant, commonly known as the stinging tree, is so painful that victims are often in pain for months. It's considered to be the most venomous plant in the world by some metrics.
I've gotten poison ivy and poison oak, and they are horrible. And so if that's even worse, I don't want to see it in my life.
Australia's physical geography is extreme, to say the least. There's a reason why it's well known for its danger. But then, so are Indonesia and Southeast Asia. So why did early British settlements focus so far away from the major colonies and trade networks of Asia?
Of course, it all starts with the Aboriginals of Australia. Once again, I've ditched a sponsor for this video because I want to tell you guys all about my awesome Substack. Every week, I write additional articles that go along with my weekly videos, and it's 100% free forever and always. So go to geographicjeff.substack.com to sign up. Enjoying this rapidly growing geography community.
Before we start this section, I'm afraid to kind of ask this question, but it's out of complete curiosity, so I feel like I can ask it. Why is it that Aboriginal Australians are more dark-skinned than people who are indigenous to Indonesia and southern India and southern Iran and Saudi Arabia and then Africa? You know what I mean? I've always wondered that, but I'm afraid I could. Do you know what I mean, guys? Like,
long before the British ever set foot on the continent, Aboriginal Australians had spent tens of thousands of years adapting to its diverse and often unforgiving landscapes. But rather than building cities, they lived in smaller, mobile communities that moved with the seasons and the availability of food and water. These patterns varied across the country, of course, and largely reflected the land itself. In the fertile southeast and along some river systems, Aboriginals could settle in place for longer periods. In the arid interior, survival required constant movement and deep environmental knowledge. Along the tropical north,
I would love to hear what the people of this area have to say about survival, just because they live in such an arid area. And if you live there, then generations of you have probably lived there. And then so you must know a lot of things to, say, find water and sustenance. And I would love to hear about the things that they learned over time.
survival required constant movement and deep environmental knowledge. Along the tropical north, communities timed their lives to the rhythms of the wet and dry seasons, adjusting their diets and their locations accordingly. Crucially, Aboriginal settlement was not organized around permanent structures, which would come to define British colonization. Instead, it was deeply rooted in a relationship with the land, shaped by dreamtime stories, seasonal migration, and stewardship practices. The landscape wasn't something to be conquered, but rather something to be understood. This kind of land use left very little physical evidence that European explorers would recognize as civilization, even though these societies were very complex in their own ways. When the British arrived in force in 1788, they brought with them a fundamentally different understanding of land, settlement, and development. They were looking for harbors, farmland, fresh water, and a temperate climate, ideally all in one one place. The site of Sydney on the southeast coast checked many of those boxes.
You know what the ironic thing about that is? Is that coming to there with this idea that if you don't have these permanent structures of existence, then you're probably less advanced. But in reality, which is ironic, if you are able to survive in an area that is so barren of these things, then you are more impressive as a civilization than those that need those climates to survive. You know?
It offered a sheltered harbor of Sydney on the southeast coast, checked many of those boxes. It offered a sheltered harbor, manageable weather, nearby forests for timber, and space to grow food. Melbourne, further south, had fertile land along the Yarra River and a cooler climate that was more familiar to British settlers. Perth, founded on the southwest coast, and Adelaide, further along the south-central shoreline, also fit into this mold. These cities became magnets for people looking to start a new life in a new part of the world, some of whom were forced. In fact, the first settlement fleet carried 788 convicts, leading to one of the most well-known, if slightly overstated, historic facts about Australia. That
I've always wondered how true those were.
it began its life.
How true that was.
Well-known, if slightly overstated, historic facts about Australia, that it began its life as a penal colony. The early Australian colonies were largely based on logistical decisions. Settlements were placed where supply ships could safely land, where agricultural output could be maximized, and where European vision of development could be imposed with relative ease. Australia, at the time, was Britain's most remote colony, which meant that it had to be self-sustaining in ways that not even the early North American colonies had to be. Of course, the early British colonizers were keen to settle the north as well, but those attempts rarely went smoothly. Early efforts in places like Port Essington and Raffles Bay, both on the northern coast, failed due to isolation, disease, and harsh conditions. Eventually, Darwin would take root, but it remained a small outpost, more connected to its military role and proximity to Asia than to its economic clout or population size. Queensland, stretching up the northeast coast,
So I guess Darwin's popularity, relative popularity, can be more attributed to its position in the world rather than its desirable climate.
did see economic clout or population size. Queensland, stretching up the northeast coast, did see more successful settlement, particularly in Brisbane and later Cairns and Townsville.
It's such a strange idea for my brain, my American brain, to think that north actually means hotter, whereas south means colder. I'm pausing too much. I'm sorry. Okay.
See more successful settlement, particularly in Brisbane and later Cairns and Townsville. But even these cities are located in the far southeast corner of the state, or nestled along more protected segments of coastline. The far north remained largely empty. All told, British settlement in Australia followed the path of least resistance, reinforcing the natural gradients laid down by the physical geography. The cities we know today didn't emerge randomly. They were products of environmental
These are the big four that I know of, and Perth as well, and Darwin, and Alice Springs, just because it's so dead center with nothing around it. But these are the big four that even if you ask Americans, who are notoriously, we are not so great at geography, that's even leaked onto an online stigma, which is kind of true. But these are the big four cities that we think of, especially Sydney. Oh wait, Canberra is your capital too. But especially Sydney, but these four, Americans would at least be like, that sounds familiar.
compatibility and colonial convenience. Settlers were not about to brave heat, malaria, flooding, and isolation when more temperate, navigable, and productive land was available elsewhere. Which brings us to today. All of these past issues have since been solved.
So why does Australia still not
And
have
Sydney.
any major cities in the north?
Australia is a large country, but it's not a very populated one.
It's huge. Again, the website, true size of.
In fact,
It is. I knew Australia was big. I didn't realize it was that big. Like,
as of
sorry.
2025, the country is only home to about 28 million people. This would make it the 54th
less than
largest
Canada.
country in the world by population. But because of its massive size, also a country with a very low population density, at only 3.5 people per square kilometer. Even Canada has 4.5 people per square kilometer. So
and it's interesting how it's opposite for the reasons that populations aren't more in some area than another. With Canada, it's because it's too darn cold, And in Australia, it's too darn hot.
Suffice it to say, Australia's population is more condensed than most other countries, and this leaves vast areas of it with very few people. But one place you might expect at least one large city would be along the northern coastline. Let's look at a map. The northern part of Australia is closer to Southeast Asia than Sydney or Melbourne. It's plain as day. Darwin is physically closer to Jakarta and Singapore than to Canberra, the capital of Australia. And in an era where global trade is dominated by ships moving through the Java and South China Sea and the ports of Singapore, Hong Kong, and Shanghai, Northern Australia appears to sit in a prime location for both imports and exports, almost like a southern gateway to Asia.
Yeah, but then you have to transport from Darwin to the more populated areas, and I know sea transportation is less costly than land transportation, even with the infrastructure. But you're both far away from the major population, and you don't have the infrastructure. And so obviously it's going to be better to just ship it to south.
And yet, the north remains largely empty, dotted with small towns and isolated outposts. Why? Well, to start, it's not like the idea hasn't occurred to Australians. In fact, politicians, military planners, and economic developers have periodically floated proposals to open up the north or create a new northern capital. But despite these ambitions, no city has ever emerged on a scale even
Also, guys,
northern.
I learned about an expedition from England that it was one of the most terrifying things I've learned about. It was from a YouTube channel called Scary Interesting, which is my favorite YouTube channel to like fall asleep to. It does kind of like scary stories, but a lot of historical scary stories, and I can't get enough of that, so I love that channel. And it talks about an expedition in like the 1700s, I think, where some horrifying things happened over...
periodically floated proposals to open up the north or create a new northern capital. But despite these ambitions, no city has ever emerged on a scale even remotely comparable to Australia's southern cities. The reasons are many, and they begin, as they often do in Australia, with geography. The tropical north is one of the most climatically challenging regions of the country. The wet season brings monsoonal rains, intense humidity, and cyclones. Roads frequently wash out, rivers flood, infrastructure decays more quickly in the heat and damp. Then the dry season arrives, stretching for months, bringing dust, fire risk, and water shortages. This climate rhythm, while manageable for small populations or for industries like mining, makes sustained urban growth difficult.
I'm curious for the reason why the weather systems are that way. That's for another time, though, I guess.
Infrastructure, predictable logistics, and steady access to water and energy. The North provides none of these easily. Even in 2025, the North's remoteness is a problem. It's not just distance from other Australian cities, it's distance from the infrastructure backbone of the country. There are few major highways, limited rail connections, and a thin web of utilities. Building and maintaining a city-scale system in such an environment requires enormous investment. And for what in return? The population base simply isn't there to justify it. Without people, there's no market. Without a market, there's no business case. And without a business case, there's no political will. Then there's the environment itself. Much of the land along the north coast is ecologically sensitive, home to wetlands, mangroves, and unique species. It's also home to some of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth. Aboriginal Australians have long lived in the north.
I already asked this question, but how did this happen? Do you know what I mean? Do you get where my confusion comes from? How did a people that look more African to me, my untrained eye, end up so separated from people of similar skin color? Part of me avoids this question because it sounds like I'm... But I'm sorry, I can't help it. How did...
Continuous cultures on Earth. Aboriginal Australians have long lived in the north, particularly in the Arnhem Land and the Kimberley, regions that remain deeply significant in cultural and spiritual terms. Large-scale urban development would disrupt these landscapes and risk further marginalizing communities that already face a host of challenges. There's also the legal dimension. Much of the land in northern...
Also, why is the sand and the earth so colored orange and red.
Australia is held under forms of Aboriginal title or is subject to land rights claims. Any expansion plan would be complex, controversial, and contested. So if the North is hard to build on, distant from population centers, and environmentally delicate, what about the strategic upside? Being closer to Asia does have value. Darwin, in particular, has taken on an increasingly important role as a military hub.
Yeah,
Hosting
okay. Actually, that gets rid of my argument.
Australian forces and rotations of U.S. Marines. Its port, controversially leased to a Chinese company in 2015 for 99 years, has become a symbol of geopolitical tensions in the Indo-Pacific. This grappling of U.S. military and Chinese economic interests highlights the strategic importance of Australia's northern region. But strategic importance doesn't automatically lead to population growth.
Sure.
A city can be militarily vital and still remain small. Fairbanks, Alaska, for example, is perhaps one of the most strategically important military locations for the United States, but the city has and will remain fairly small.
You have to have another reason for people to voluntarily move to a place other than, well, it's important for our military.
Economic potential has its limits. Northern Australia is rich in minerals, cattle, and gas. It has supported large-scale resource extraction for decades. But these industries don't necessarily require large cities to function. Mining towns rise and fall with commodity cycles. Workers fly in and fly out, usually on months-long cycles. Investment comes in bursts, not in steady flows. That kind of boom and bust economy doesn't build sustainable urban environments like those seen in Melbourne or Sydney. Basically, it builds camps, not cities. In the end, the logic of the South continues to dominate Australia, where about 98% of Australia's population lives. The southeast corner,
I'm sure you could cut that to like, boom, and in there.
in particular, with its temperate climate, deep water ports, major rivers, and large existing populations, remains the natural heart of the country. The original decisions made by early colonists to settle Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane,
Did James Cook reach Australia?
Adelaide, and Perth weren't just historic accidents. They were decisions reinforced by geography, climate, and connectivity. And in the north, for all its potential, it continues to remain on the periphery, with just 2% of Australia's entire population and no major cities. Darwin, the largest city along the northern coastline, is home to just 140,000 people, and the north as a whole, a little less than 600,000. In the end, geography dictated the first settlements of Australia. History cemented them in place. And now, even in an age of globalization and shifting trade routes, the inertia of those early choices keeps Australia's cities anchored far from its northern shores.
I know some of you will probably lean into the whole tropics thing for why there's no city there, but tropical cities tend to fare quite well actually in terms of population growth. Even Britain founded plenty of successful tropical cities such as modern Singapore. Australia in this regard is just different. Speaking of Australia, this week and the 2 weeks before it, I've been cruising around the country, from the southwest to the outback, and now Tasmania. If you want to see what Australia's geography is really like, go check out those videos on my travel channel.
I hope you enjoyed learning all about Australia's northern coast. If you did, why not check out this video all about why Indonesia is
I did, if you did.
moving its capital and why it's a disaster. Thanks.
I can understand why Indonesia might be moving its capital, maybe to like more near the Strait of Malacca. Is that right? But moving it further to the east doesn't make much sense to me.
Thanks for watching. See you next time.
Great video, Geography by Geoff, fantastic channel. I would love to tell you guys a story about what happened like right here. Was it a Dutch ship? It was scary, and I listened to it many times, and I should know more about it, but it was freaky. Anyways, fantastic channel. Obviously, I mean, it's not like you're right at an important strait. The Strait of Malacca, if I am getting that right, is much more northwest. But the climate says a lot, and in the meantime, while this area isn't well populated, then you don't really have a great incentive to move giant ports and whatnot, or create rail structures when it's still much more cheap to just send it by ship to the areas that are already populated. So that makes sense. Love y'all. Hope you're all doing well. You're all doing well. And I would love for any comments down below. You guys are always awesome in the comments. If I said anything you disagree with, call me out, answering in my questions. You guys are awesome. Hopefully I'll see you guys next time. Bye.